morning.
Am I turned on? I guess I
Can you hear us okay?
Not yet.
not turned on. How about now? There we go. Just a matter of flipping the button. Excuse me. Well, I'd like to talk this morning about the lesson that we just read from 2 Corinthians, or as President Trump might say, 2 Corinthians. But let me turn this down a little bit. In the lesson, Paul talks a lot about boasting. And in the first verse, which is not part of the lesson, he says, boasting is necessary, but it's not profitable. And then he goes on to talk about that. And the question is why? What's he talking about when he talks about this boasting? Well, there's a backstory to this. In Corinth, as throughout much of the Roman world, anyone who was an official in the city was expected to tout his achievements, a lot like modern politicians. They were expected to celebrate what they had done. They had monuments built and commemorating their service, and coins were minted to show their great deeds. And they were expected to frequently remind the people of what they had done. For soldiers, there was a special honor. In time of war, when they were besieging a city, they would throw ladders against the wall of the city and climb the ladders and scale the wall. And the first soldier to survive over the wall, the first soldier over the wall who survived, was given a special honor. It was called the Corona Moralis. It was like the Congressional Medal of Honor. But in the fog of war, it was often difficult to discern who was the first one over. So the soldiers had to make their case after the battle, and they had to brag a little bit about what they had done. Well, at Corinth, there were a number of people in the church who were asking Paul to tout his achievements. Why should we listen to you? There were other teachers, other evangelists who were coming throughout the Greek world spreading the gospel. And they were saying to Paul, who are you that we should listen to you? He wasn't particularly physically imposing. He was shabbily dressed. He was not real articulate. And they were living in a celebrity culture. And they wanted Paul to offer a resume for his achievements, his credentials. So Paul turns this into a sort of this demand, he turns into a kind of tongue-in-cheek parody, essentially, of this practice. He says in the previous chapter that since many people boast in the way the world does, I'm going to boast too. He doesn't want to do it, but he's going to do it. He then lays out his achievements. And they were these. He says, 5 times I was whipped with 39 lashes. 3 times I was beaten with sticks. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked, spending a night and a day at sea. I often went without sleep. I knew hunger and I knew thirst. I was exposed naked to the cold. In Damascus, the governor had the city guarded in order to arrest him. But he was lowered in a basket through the city wall, through a window in the city wall. He was lowered down so he was able to flee and escape. Well, there you have it, Paul said. That's my list of achievements. Pretty impressive, isn't it? In other words, he's saying, in a self-deprecating way, if you're looking for achievements as the world sees them, I'm not your guy. I thought it was kind of interesting that the contrast between Paul saying that he was let down in a basket through the window in the wall, the contrast with the soldier who scales the wall in battle heroically. Here he is being let down in a basket so that he can flee from the ruler of Damascus through the wall. Anyway, he closes chapter 12 with this famous passage that we read today. He, Christ, said to me, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my strength is made perfect in weakness. Most gladly, therefore, will I rather boast in my weaknesses, that the power of Christ may dwell in me. Therefore, I am well content with weaknesses, with insults, in distresses, in persecutions, in difficulties for Christ's sake. For when I am weak, then I am strong." I'd like to dwell for just a few minutes this morning on these verses. Tell you a couple stories. Josh McDowell, I don't know if any of you have ever heard of Josh McDowell. He's one of the greatest Christian apologists of my generation. McDowell, an apologist, is someone who makes a defense of the faith. His book, Evidence That Demands a Verdict, which we have up in our library, made a powerful impression on me when I was in my 20s. His story captures some of the flavor of how God takes weakness and mediocrity and converts it into strength to use for his purposes. McDowell was raised on a farm with an alcoholic father who physically abused his mother. He was sexually abused himself from the ages of 6 to 13 by a man who worked on the farm. His older sister took her own life. He grew up broken and with contempt for Christianity. In fact, as a young man, he set out to disprove Christianity. He even went as far as traveling to Europe so that he could study the original documents to show that the resurrection of Jesus never happened. But at the end of all his research, he discovered, in his own words, that the biblical account of the resurrection just had to be true. There was no other explanation for it than that Jesus actually physically rose from the dead. He began to attend church, and through his relationship with his pastor and support of friends, he began to follow Christ. He eventually came to believe that he needed to tell his father that he loved him, even though he didn't feel it. And he needed to forgive the man who had abused him. But before he could do this, he was in a terrible car accident. To recuperate, he had to go back to the home where he had suffered so much pain and so much shame. He was confined to a bed, strapped to a board, recovering from a back injury. And it was during that time of utter weakness that he found the opportunity to share Christ with his father. Through Josh's witness in that moment of weakness, his father became a Christian. And his conversion, because everybody in the town knew him before, his conversion astonished the people in the town and led others in their small community to faith in Jesus Christ. I'm going to return to Josh's story in a minute, but reading about his father reminded me of a man that that some of you may remember. He was a member here in the church back in the 1970s. His name was Creedon Widener. Anybody remember Creedon? I'm sure many of you remember his lovely wife, Jeannie, who was with us until a few years ago. Creedon was a good father and husband, but he had lived a hard life. Jeannie would come to church on Sunday to pray for him. Creedon would head to the bar. But one day he came to the point where the hound of heaven tracked him down. He didn't like the gospel much. He didn't have much time for church people. But he did enjoy gospel music. His daughter-in-law told him one day about a TV show on Sunday morning that had good gospel music. So Jeannie, one Sunday, headed off here to church. She used to sit right back there. And Creedon turned on the TV set rather than going to the bar. And at the end of the show, after the music and the sermon, the preacher pointed, sort of like that poster of Uncle Sam wants you. The preacher pointed through the TV set like he was pointing right at Creedon. And he said that he needed to give his life to Christ. Well, Creedon didn't like that much. The next Sunday, he turned on the show again. He wanted to listen to the music. But he took his chair and pushed it off to the side. So that when the preacher pointed, he wouldn't be pointing at him. Well, when the end of the show came, and the preacher pointed, I think the preacher was Rex Humbard. Does anybody remember Rex Humbard? The preacher pointed again and said that he wanted whoever was out there to give their life to Christ. Creedon's sitting off to the side, and he said it was, Creedon used to tell this story, that's why I'm telling it. He told me he wasn't afraid to tell it. He was sitting off to the side, and it looked at him like the preacher was pointing right around the corner of the TV set, pointing right at him. Well, he yielded. And in that moment, he gave his life to Christ. And he was never the same man after that. He couldn't do enough for the church. He did everything he could to help out around the church. He wanted to devote his life to helping others find what he found. He and Jeannie opened their home one night a week to a small group fellowship. Back then when this church was experiencing a powerful spiritual renewal back in the 70s. Pastor Patty alluded to the youth group last week. Our youth group, during this time, there were times when there were hundreds of people coming to the youth group meetings. Hundreds. There were youth groups coming from Hershey, as far away as Hershey, to come to our church because of this spiritual renewal that was taking place. I can remember, and some of you can remember too, that at Christmas and Easter, the ushers would have to put folding chairs down the sides of the church and down the center of the aisles to accommodate the crowds. Well, during that time, Creedon and Jeannie opened their homes, and dozens of people, many of the members of this church, came to their home for that fellowship group and found strength and spiritual growth in those meetings. In fact, you remember the Kilgore brothers? Lanny preached a couple weeks ago and Bobby sang. They and their wives were part of that. Everyone who came was inspired by Creedon's testimony and the strength of his faith, despite the weakness of his body, inspired everyone. His body was weak because by that time he was severely racked by the emphysema, which would eventually claim him. He couldn't say much, couldn't talk much. But in his weakness, there was an amazing strength that influenced more people than he could ever know. It was as if God had said to him, "You think you're weak, Cretan, but my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in your weakness." And it was. Anyway, back to Josh McDowell. Just a year and a half after his conversion, Josh's father passed away. If young Josh had not been in that automobile accident, he may not have had the opportunity to reconcile with his father. That reconciliation resulted in numerous changed lives in his community. And then a turning point in his life came after a chapel service while he was still in college. The speaker was calling upon students to use their gifts and talents for God's kingdom. Like many of us, Josh felt that he had no gifts or talents to give. All he had was a history of brokenness and failure. One day he prayed to God, "I only have weakness, Lord, but I'll give all my failures to you to bring you glory. Every breath I breathe will be to serve you." Since that prayer, Josh has written 127 different books. In 50 years, he has delivered more than 24,000 talks to over 10 million young people and their families in 125 different countries. It's as if God said, "You think you're weak, Josh, but my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in your weakness." And it was. So what's the point that I'm trying to make with these stories of Cretan and Josh? I'm sure a lot of us would like to see this church filled again. I think a lot of us would like to see the day come again when we can put folding chairs down the aisles to accommodate the crowds. I'm also sure that there's no magic formula for achieving that. But there is one thing. There is one thing that's necessary. You see, sometimes like Josh, we feel there's nothing that we can do for God. We have no particular talent. We have nothing really to offer. Tom Keeper, who spoke here a couple of weeks ago, touched on this in his sermon. Maybe we think we're too old. After all, Josh McDowell was a young man when he started on his life's work. It's true. But Cretan wasn't. Besides, the people in that church who mentored Josh McDowell, who launched him on his career, who answered his questions and took him under their wing, they weren't young men. No one is too old. No one is too uneducated. No one is too unskilled. But there is one thing that we have to have that maybe we lack. We have to have what I used to hear my fellow coaches when I used to coach high school. One thing that I used to hear coaches talk about, we have to have a want-to. You know what I mean by a want-to? We have to want God to use us. That desire to be used grows out of a gratitude for what God has done for us. And if we're driven by that gratitude, if we have the want to, God will supply all the rest. Just as he did for Cretan, just as he did for Josh. The key is gratitude and a desire to be used that flows from a grateful heart. I have an acquaintance, one more story if you'll bear with me. I have an acquaintance in his 60s. He was dying. His liver had given out. He was paying the price for many years of abusing his liver. But because of an organ transplant, he has been given what he calls a second life. He was never particularly prone to talking about God before. In fact, I don't even know if he even believed in God. But now he's so grateful for the second chance that he has, that he's unabashed in saying that he believes God has a purpose for giving him this new life. And he wants to do whatever it is that God has for him. He doesn't know what that is, but he knows that God will show it to him. When a man comes to the end of his rope and feels he has nothing to give, God can use him if he wants to be used. It's never too late. We may not be at the end of our rope. We may feel, though, that we don't have any gifts or abilities. But we do. We all have life experience. We all have successes. We all have failures. And those things are the raw material that God can use to shape something beautiful out of the rest of our life. I think he just wants us to make ourselves available to him so that he can work through us. All we need is a want to. When we're tempted to think that there's nothing we can do, that we're too weak, that we fail too often, God says to us what he said to Paul, what he said to Creed, what he said to Josh McDowell, and millions of others. My grace is sufficient for you. My strength